Dear Mama, I am writing again, though I do not know if this letter will ever reach you. After Stalingrad, we thought maybe the worst had passed. We had crossed the Volga under fire, slept in holes, fought in rooms where the walls had more bullet holes than bricks, and watched winter chew through men as easily as bullets. But now, they say the Germans are coming again. Not to a city this time, to a pocket in the map. The officers call it Kursk Salient, a great curve in the front line sticking westward into German territory like a fist. And Germans, being Germans, looked at this obvious threat and said, yes, let's attack that.
By the summer of 1943, the Eastern Front had changed. At Stalingrad, the German army had suffered a disaster so large that even Berlin's propaganda machine had trouble polishing it. The Wehrmacht was still dangerous, very dangerous, but the aura of invincibility was gone. For the first time, the Red Army had not just survived, it had won. And now, near the city of Kursk, both sides prepared for what would become one of the largest and most brutal battles in human history. The German plan was called Operation Citadel. The idea was simple: attack the Kursk salient from the north and south, sever it off, surround the Soviet armies inside, and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Simple, which in military planning usually means several 100,000 men are about to have a very bad week. From the north came Army Group Center with General Walter Model 9th Army. From the south came Army Group South with forces under Erich von Manstein, including Hermann Haas 4th Panzer Army. The Germans brought Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinand tank destroyers, Panzer IVs, assault guns, artillery, aircraft, and a deep belief that if enough steel was pushed into one spot, history would potentially move it out of the way. But the Soviets knew they were coming. Thanks to intelligence, reconnaissance, intercepted communications, partisan reports, and the simple fact that the Germans had preparing this offensive with all the subtle of a marching band falling down the stairs. The Red Army had time, and time, at Kursk, became a weapon. The Soviets built defensive belts in depth. Not one line, not two, but layers of trenches, minefields, anti-tank ditches, artillery zones, machine gun nests, and bunkers, all fallback positions. There were millions of mines laid around the salient. Anti-tank guns were dug in and camouflaged. Infantry had orders to let the tanks pass, then attack the German infantry behind them. Artillery crews pre-registered targets. Engineers turned fields into murder puzzles. By July, Kursk was no longer just a battlefield. It was a giant Soviet mousetrap. And the Germans were bringing very expensive mice.
Dear Mama, they have us digging every day. Trenches, communication trenches, foxholes, gun pits. If a man stands still too long, someone may hand him a shovel and declare him part of the defensive line. The political officer says we are building a grave for fascism. Sergeant Mikhail says we are building the world's largest latrine, but with more mines. I think both may be correct.
On July 5th, 1943, Operation Citadel began. But before the Germans' attack fully opened, the Soviets unleashed a massive artillery barrage on their own, trying to disrupt German assembly areas. It did not stop the offensive, but it did send a message: we know you're there. In the north, Model's 9th Army slammed into the defense of Konstantin Rokossovsky's central front. The advance was slow, almost immediately. The German tanks and infantry had to fight through minefields, anti-tank guns, artillery fire, and Soviet counterattacks. Every village became a strong point. Every ridge had guns behind it. Every field looked empty until it started exploding. The Germans advanced, but at a terrible pace. At Kursk, progress was measured not in miles, but in bodies, burned out vehicles, and exhausted commanders asking why the map looked easier yesterday. The Germans had powerful machines. The Tiger was heavily armored and deadly at long range. The Ferdinand tank destroyer had a massive gun and thick armor, and the new Panthers that had been promised. But at Kursk, many Panthers suffered mechanical problems early on, because nothing says a master race engineering quite like bringing a brand new tank to the largest armored battle in history and discovering it has the reliability of a nervous toaster. Still, German units remained tactically skilled. They inflicted heavy losses. They knew how to coordinate armor, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. But the problem was not whether they could break one Soviet line. The problem was that behind that line was another line, and behind that line was another. And behind that line was a Soviet officer with a clipboard saying, "Good, they are almost where we want them." In the south, the German attack made more progress. Manstein's forces pushed hard against Nikolai von Turn-Voronez's forces. The fighting was savage. German panzer formations drove toward Obiang and Prokhorovka, trying to break into open ground. Here, the Germans came closest to achieving something dangerous. The Soviet defensive bent. It did not break, and as the German spearhead pushed deeper, Soviet reserves moved forward. Among them was the 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by Pavel Rosmstrov. Their destination was Prokhorovka.
Dear Mama, we hear the tanks before we see them. At night, the ground shakes. The men stop talking when it happens. Even the jokes die for a moment. Someone said the German Tigers can destroy our tanks before we are close enough to fire. Someone else said our T-34s are faster. Sergeant Mikhail said speed is very useful when running toward death. He laughed after saying it. No one else did.
On July 12, 1943, near Prokhorovka, Soviet armor counterattacked German forces of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. This battle became one of the most famous armored clashes of World War II. For years, it was described as the largest tank battle in history, with huge claims of German tank losses. Modern research has complicated that picture. Prokhorovka was still massive, chaotic, and deadly, but not the simple legend of endless Soviet tanks smashing endless German Tigers. The battlefield was cramped, broken by gullies, rail embankments, smoke, dust, and confusion. Soviet T-34s and T-70s charged forward, trying to close the distance where German long-range gunnery was less effective. German tanks and anti-tank guns fired into the attack. At close range, the fighting became brutal. Tanks rammed through smoke. Crews fired at silhouettes. Infantry clung to the ground as armored vehicles burned around them. It was not elegant. It was not chess. It was a steel bar fight in a burning barn. The Soviets suffered very heavy tank losses at Prokhorovka, but the Germans failed to achieve the breakthrough they needed. And that was the key. At Kursk, Germany did not need a local success. It needed a decisive victory. It needed to destroy Soviet reserves, regain momentum, and change the course of the war. Instead, it was being bled. Also, on July 12th, the Soviets launched Operation Citadel against the German-held Kursk Salient in the north. This mattered enormously. While German forces were still trying to push into Kursk, the Red Army was already beginning its own counteroffensive elsewhere. And, just like I always say, the hunters had become the hunted. Then, in August, the Soviets launched Operation Rumenosiv towards the Belgorod and the Kharkiv. The Battle of Kursk was not just one German attack. It was a defensive battle followed by Soviet counterpunches. The Germans came to Kursk hoping to cut off assailant. Instead, they lost the initiative. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would still fight hard. It would still counterattack. It would still inflict terrible losses. But it would never again launch a major strategic offensive in the east on the scale of Citadel. From here on, the overall direction of the war was west. Towards the Dnieper, towards Ukraine, towards Poland, towards Berlin.
Dear Mama, the fields, they are black now. Not from the earth, but from the smoke. These are places where the grass is gone, the trees are split, and the tanks sit like dead animals. Some are ours, some are German. After a while, it becomes hard to tell. We passed a burned-out tank today. Someone had written on it with chalk, "The Berlin." I don't know who wrote it, but everyone saw it.
Kursk was a Soviet victory, but victory on the Eastern Front was rarely clean. The Red Army paid heavily in men and machines. German losses were also serious, especially because Germany could not replace experienced crews, vehicles, and aircraft as easily as the Soviet Union increasingly could. That was one of the great realities of 1943. The war had become a contest of endurance, and Germany was running out of breath. The Soviet Union had moved factories east. Production was growing. Commanders were learning. Coordination was improving. The Red Army of 1943 was not the shattered force of 1941. It was harder, smarter, better supplied, and increasingly confident. The Germans still had tactical brilliance, but the Soviets, they had depth, intelligence, preparation, reserves, industry, and a willingness to absorb punishment that horrified their enemies. At Kursk, German armor drove into defenses designed not simply to stop it, but to consume it. In fairness, Operation Citadel was not insane on paper. The Kursk Salient did look tempting, but so does a bear trap if you stare at it long enough and think, perhaps if I bite it first. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of Germany's ability to dictate the war in the east. Stalingrad had broken the myth. Kursk broke the momentum. After Kursk, the Red Army moved from defense to offense, and despite the enormous loss still to come, began the long road west. For the soldiers who fought there, Kursk was not a grand turning point. It was mud, mines, smoke, screaming engines, artillery, fear, and survival. It was sleeping in trenches. It was watching the horizon flash at night. It was hearing tanks before seeing them. It was writing letters home and not knowing if anyone would ever read them.
Dear Mama, they say we have won. No one cheers much when they say this. Not because we are not glad, but because everyone here is tired, and too many friends are missing from roll call. Still, something has changed. At Stalingrad, we learned the Germans could be stopped. At Kursk, we learned they could be pushed back. I do not know when I will come home, but today, for the first time, Berlin feels less like a word on a map and more like a direction. Your son, Ivan.